I'm over here with the Lebanese Canadian author, poet, activist, speaker, and educator, Najwa Zebian. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. How are you?
I'm doing great as well. It is an honor to have you here to speak to you. Let's just jump right into it. I know that usually you take your experience as a kickoff point for your writing. So, how did your upbringing in Canada as an Arab kid turn you into an author?
So I was actually raised in Lebanon for most of my early years. I moved to Canada when I was 16. I visited here a few times with my family, but the final move was made when I was 16 years old. But I was always surrounded with the English language and way of expression from a young age because my mom spent most of her life in Canada. So she she was an English language teacher.
Yeah.
So I learned a lot from her. And I believe that the upbringing between Lebanon and Canada, in a way, taught me about different ways of expression as opposed to there just being only one way of expressing yourself, one language. I always spoke both in English and in Arabic. My cousins who moved from Canada, they were born and raised in Canada, they moved to Lebanon. So, and I was really young, I was 7 or 8 years old when they moved, so I would speak to them in English and then I would go out and play with my other friends and I would speak in Arabic, and in school I would speak in Arabic. And I had a very heavy religious education as well, because in the village where we live, there was a mosque right across from our house. Like it's literally right in front of our house. And I grew up listening to Quran 5 times a day, the call for prayer 5 times a day. My grandma, who lived her whole life in Lebanon, lived with us, and she would tell me stories of the prophets, and just she was so embedded in history, and I loved listening to stories. I loved listening to, those stories aren't just stories. There's always a lesson to be learned. There's so
Absolutely.
much impact in them. So I feel like having that upbringing around people speaking different languages, as well as people from different ages, like I spent most of my time around older people, around my grandma, around my dad. My siblings were considerably older than me. Long story short, my parents met and got married in Canada. They had 5 kids, then moved to Lebanon because they wanted their kids to learn Arabic. And then 8 years later, I was born. So there was that age difference. And so I felt like, reflecting back, constantly being around those who were older than me made me mature at a much younger age than you would expect, and I'd contemplate life, I'd contemplate everything, like what's the meaning of life, what do you live for, what's right, what's wrong, what does dignity mean, what does things that a child wouldn't think of. And so I feel like those early years prepared me. They were years of me keeping that expression on the inside, and at one point it started coming out, and that was a few years ago. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. You're basically telling me that you had all these emotions and the questions and the feelings, and you just took it all and put it onto paper.
Yes. Yeah. And I'm very lucky to have been able to do that, because I know many people would just leave that on the inside and say, whatever, they're just my thoughts, they're just my feelings. But there was an intensity with which those thoughts and feelings came to the surface, to the point where I had to let it out, because if I didn't, I felt like I was suffocating. So it began as me sitting in front of my journal and writing. It didn't begin as I'm sharing these writings with the world. It began, that was the first step, is listening to yourself, letting those thoughts out for yourself, just so you could feel that sense of relief. And then bit by bit, when I started sharing those writings with those around me, there was a sense of, we want more. This is great. This is exactly how I've been feeling for years, and you just put it on paper. And so that's when I started believing that, oh, like my thoughts actually, I'm not alone in thinking this way. I'm not lonely in thinking this way. I'm not the only one. And also, like, they make sense. It's not that they're as complicated as I think they are. They actually make sense to people. So there was that validation. Not that I needed it, but I do have to, like, give credit to the people around me that they took a big part in me taking that step of actually putting my work out into the world.
And so Mind Platter, was that written for you, for your younger self, or for other people who might have gone through the similar things, since you said that everything you wrote felt relatable to other people and it was not as complicated as you thought it was?
Yeah, so it did begin as me trying to express what was going on the inside. And I remember vividly what gave me that push to sit down and write was my students. So I'll give you a backstory. I've told this story many times, but for anyone who's listening for the first time, so I moved here to Canada at 16 years of age, and at that point my whole family had already moved here, like one after the other. My parents were here, my siblings were here, and at the time I was living with my sister in Lebanon. And for the years before that, for about 7 or 8 years, there was constant travel in my family. So I didn't really have that consistent feeling of I'm in one place, that consistent feeling of being home, of feeling as a child that I was safe, my emotions were safe, that if somebody bullied me at school, I had someone to speak to. It was inconsistent. And so in a way, I learned to keep my thoughts to myself, and I learned to internalize the reasons for why that's happening. Because as a child, as a teenager, you don't understand that it's not your fault that this is happening. All you think is, well, it must be, this is just my life. It must be what I deserve. It's just, you don't know any better. You haven't spoken to others about it. You don't know how to distinguish between a thought and reality, a feeling and reality. So I started writing in a journal that my friend gifted me in Lebanon. I was 13 years old, and I would just write my thoughts and feelings into it. Nobody ever had access to them. That journal stayed with me wherever I went. So if I was staying home, if my parents were around, that journal was there. If I was living at my uncle's for a short period of time, I would take that journal with me. So in a way, that journal was the only safe thing I had. It was the place where I trusted that I wouldn't be judged, that somebody's listening, and in a way I was listening to myself. And so when I moved here, the plan was that I would come here for a couple of months and then I would decide if I wanted to stay or not. And then shortly after I came, the war broke out in Lebanon. This would have been the summer of 2006. And in a way, I was forced to stay. And I convinced myself at the time, no, I made that choice because, I'm going to university the year after and all that stuff. But technically, I didn't really make that choice. So I felt that I was further away from that feeling of home that I already didn't feel I had, but Lebanon was familiar. And my grandma, who I brought up earlier, who I loved, lived there. And my school was there, and my friends were there. My very few friends were there. And I just felt like that was taken away from me. And writing about it hurt so much that I just ripped up my journal and said, I don't want to write anymore because I don't want to feel anymore. Every time I would write, there would be this helplessness that would come through. Like, why am I even writing? I'm not changing what's going on. I'm just continuing to sulk in the pain of feeling not mistreated, but displaced, I would say. That's the right word. That I don't know where I am and who I am and how my life is going to be. And there was that uncertainty and I didn't want to feel it. So I became numb for a few years. I just went through the motions of life. I finished high school, I went to university. I was very quiet, very reserved during those years, and didn't really write, didn't really express myself. And I became a teacher. And this would have been 7 years after I arrived in Canada. And the very first teaching assignment that I had, the principal walked in and said, he walked in with 8 students, and they were from, their ages ranged from grade 2 to grade 8. So the oldest would have been 13 or 14 years old, and the youngest would have been 7 or 8 years old. And the principal said, these are your responsibility. You're going to teach them the English language. They were refugees from Libya. And I'll never forget that day. I remember exactly where we were standing when he introduced us. And I looked at them and I saw my 16-year-old self who came here feeling like, what's going on? Where am I? And I was familiar with Canada, but not as a place to live. It was always like a temporary, I'm here for a couple of months to see my family and then I'm going back. I never really got used to life here. I never got used to speaking in English all the time. I never got used to the traditions, to the what's accepted, what's not accepted, what's considered acceptable by society and what's not considered acceptable. I just never took the time to learn that, and here I was as a 16-year-old just not knowing how to comprehend this world. And I looked at those kids and I saw that same perplexed look in their eyes, and that's what pushed me to start writing again about the feeling of being in a place where you feel like you don't belong. And so I started writing to tell my students, you do matter, you do belong. I understand what you're going through because I went through it. And so I started writing about education in a way, like how should education be? What should the purpose of education be? Is it just about memorizing? Is it just about marks? Or do we look at our students as human beings who are living, who are breathing, who are thinking, who have gone through certain things? So in a way, my writing began again to advocate for others who experienced the same things I experienced. And as I was helping them heal and advocating for them, in a way I was healing my 16-year-old self that I never took the time to heal. So that's what Mind Platter was. It was all of those writings that began when I became a teacher, compiled. So they really were years. It was years in the making. It's not something that I can tell you I sat down thinking this was going to be published into a book. I never thought that until after all of those writings were done, and everyone who read a piece or two said, I want all of these in one place. And that's when I started thinking of putting them into a book. So that was the most raw, authentic, real piece of work that anyone could ever put out into the world. So yeah, that was Mind Platter.
I can see that vulnerability or exposing yourself in the most rawest of ways is super important to you, or at least a recurring theme, because we also see that in Sparks of a Phoenix and Nectar of Themes.
Yes.
And that is super, honestly, like, it's very powerful, because you rarely see people who are willing to take everything inside them and put them on a piece of paper. And is only, relatability or advocating for other people who might be in your same position, is that the only reason that you're becoming more vulnerable? Or is it also for yourself as well, going forward into the future? You spoke about your past and growing up and when you were 16, but is this like a sort of a reference, like sort of like when you write a note for yourself and then in the future you read it and you're like, this is what I wrote? It is sort of pushing me, making me keep on going.
Yeah. So I would definitely say there is an element of both. I do it to help others heal, but I also do it to help myself heal. And my writing has really evolved over the years. I still write as vulnerably as I've always written, but because of the amount of knowledge that I've accumulated over the years because I've written so much. See, the thing is, I don't think people understand the power of just sitting down and writing what's on your mind without thinking to yourself, is this going to help someone? You know, what am I going to do with this piece of work? Is it going to be accepted? Is it going to be validated by others? Without thinking of any of that, just sitting down and writing. I used to go to a coffee shop and sit for hours and just write. And I could never anticipate where I was going to end up, like what topic, which wound am I opening and going back to? Which themes are popping out at me from the writing, telling me, you forgot to deal with this? Or are these two things connected? These two things from the past and from your present? Just sitting down and allowing the writing to flow from within is such a vulnerable act on its own. But to do that without thinking of the outcome is really that's the gold. That's the gold in the writing. It's not the finished product or what you think it should be. So because I've allowed myself to do that without thinking of the end product, or how can I make money out of this, or how many people is this going to help, that's what allowed me to actually heal through writing, to actually see the parts of me that I never saw before and connect the dots and say, my story didn't begin a year or two ago. My story began the moment I was born, and those memories, those things that happened, the environment that I was raised in, the beliefs that I was taught, the people who were surrounding me, all of that made me who I am. And it got me to a place where, you know how so many people just live their lives the way that society around them has dictated that they live it, and they never really give themselves the right to question how life is. You see life a certain way. I grow up, I go to school, I get married, I have kids, I get a job, you see that and you live that way without even thinking that maybe there is another way. So writing allowed me to ask myself, is this how I want to live my life? Do I believe that? Do I, believe that certain boundaries that are placed on me as a woman, or me as a Muslim woman, or me as a writer, me as a daughter, as a sister, do I believe that those boundaries are right? And like, how far do I want to go with my life? So it's the spilling out of all of that vulnerability from within that's, instead of continuing to live my life a certain way, I started choosing how I wanted to live my life. So if I look at my past writings now, I'm compassionate with my younger self, and I say, I know why you wrote that. You were hurt. You were trying to explain how you were feeling, but the older, more mature, wiser me would have taken away so much of that blame that's in my writing. I blame the world. I blame the people around me for many things. I expect many things from those around me and from the world, and I expect someone to amplify my voice for me. Whereas now, my writing is very much centered on me. And when I write for others, it's very much centered on, ask yourself, why is this hurting me? As opposed to expecting that other people are going to fix your situation for you. Always come back to yourself. Ask yourself why you're reacting a certain way. So the evolution of my writing has really come to fruition with so much more wisdom than where I began. But I wouldn't be here had I not given myself permission to just be as I am in the moment and be as vulnerable as I was in the moment. I know that that's a very long-winded answer, but that the answer is I do write for others, but it always stems from me trying to understand myself. And once I do that, I try to translate it into my writings to coach anyone who's reading as to, to take the same steps that I took, because I feel like that's really going to assist them in becoming the best version of themselves that they can become.
And is this what Soul Academy and the Stories of the Soul are all about? Because now you've ventured into a different medium. One is podcasting. That is, you can say it is similar to writing, whether it's poetry or prose, in the sense that you're storytelling, maybe you're having conversations. But at Digital Academy, now you are an educator. But how different is it? Is it the same platform that you're using as your books, or is it a bit different? Is it more enhanced, or does it have limitations?
Yeah. So Soul Academy, I began it because I get so many questions from people about different topics. And so I decided, instead of just answering people separately, because I really don't have the amount of time that is required to help every single person out there, I thought I would package it into a course where I would walk through it step by step with anybody who's really needing to be coached, or someone to hold their hand as they're going through something. So the first topic that I wanted to address was letting go. And that was very well received. And so the whole intention behind it was, if you are struggling with letting go of anything, here are the steps to do that. Here are some powerful strategies that worked with me that I know will work with you, or a derivative of them will work with you. So that was Soul Academy. I wanted to bring the knowledge that I had with the skills that I acquired as a teacher to bring a practical way to let go. And then with Stories of the Soul, the podcast, I listened to so many podcasts, and it was always the same people being interviewed, always the same celebrities, always the same people who had a platform to tell their stories already. And it was very much, from my point of view, yes, they are trying to bring wisdom to the general population, but at the same time, I felt like they weren't digging deeply enough. And I wanted that. I wanted to dig deeply into a person's soul and have them share their stories. And then I thought, it hasn't been a long time since I've had a platform. And I remember the days when I felt like my story didn't matter, or who's going to care about what I'm going through. And so I wanted Stories of the Soul to give those who didn't have a platform to share their stories. And that's why in the first 12 episodes that you've probably heard, 2 of them are just by me, but the rest are different people being interviewed, people from different walks of life. And they were all telling stories of forgiveness. And so you begin listening to the episode not knowing who this person is. You see a name, you see Jenna, or you see Philip, but you don't know who that person is. And so you sit there and you listen. There is a power in stories, in individual stories that are unique, that no other story that's publicized already and everybody knows about it can bring. There's such a, like, the best stories I heard were on my way to the airport, where the Uber driver told me his story, or someone that I met at the airport who has no idea who I am and I have no idea who they are, and they should just share their life with me. Those are the best stories because they're unfiltered. The person isn't thinking to themselves, how many people are going to listen to this? Are they going to judge me? They just spill their heart out. And I really wanted to bring that to a wider audience. So that's where Stories of the Soul came from. And we're going to restart it again. And this time we're going to be interviewing more people, but people who have a platform, but not too big of a platform, so that we could help them reach more people as well with their stories. So thank you for asking me about that.
What is next for Najwa Zebian? You've done a podcast, you've done a Distill Academy, and you've written 3 books. Are there going to be more books in your future, or are you going to go towards something completely different?
Yeah, so I definitely plan on continuing to do everything I have been doing, including writing. So I actually just finished writing my 4th book, and it's going to be similar to what we just discussed, bringing the teaching skills and looking at the needs out there in the world. What are people mostly needing help with? Putting that together and offering them a way to heal and come back to themselves. So that's what's next. I would look out for a 4th book.
That sounds incredible. Thank you so much, Najwa, for speaking to me.
This is Pulse 95.